1. Chapter 1. Noah Black was a man who had walked through hell. He was tall, with a lean build that spoke of a life lived on the run. His once pristine clothes were tattered, stained with the blood and grime of a world that had fallen apart. His face, chiseled and sharp, was covered in a rough beard that had grown unchecked for months. But his eyes were the most telling, cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and survived it all. He moved through the wasteland like a ghost. The sky above was a sickly gray, the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds that had turned the world into a perpetual twilight. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only sounds were the distant moans of the undead and the soft crunch of nose boots on the cracked asphalt. He knew the wasteland well. He had been wandering it for years, ever since the outbreak had turned the world into this nightmare. Cities that were once teeming with life were now empty shells, filled with the dead and the desperate. The roads, once the veins of civilization, were now littered with the wreckage of what had been. Noah had a destination in mind. A city, or what was left of it, on the edge of the horizon. He had heard whispers in the ruins, rumors of a hidden enclave where a man named Dr. Adrian Kane was said to be working on a cure. Noah wasn't one to chase rumors, but he had seen enough to know that even the wildest stories often had a kernel of truth. The city came into view as he crested a hill. It was a sprawling ruin, its buildings crumbling, their windows shattered. The streets were choked with debris, the remnants of cars, and the corpses of the dead, some still moving in that grotesque parody of life. Noah paused, scanning the area with the practiced eye of a survivor. The entrance to the city was a gaping wound in the earth, a highway that had collapsed into a massive sinkhole. The only way in was to climb down, a risky maneuver that would leave him exposed to the zombies that prowled the area. Noah took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the steel pipe he carried. His revolver was holstered at his side, but he had learned long ago to save his bullets for when he really needed them. He started down the slope, his movements slow and deliberate. The ground was loose, crumbling beneath his feet, but he kept his balance. Halfway down, a sound made him freeze, a low guttural growl, followed by the shuffling of feet. He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing as he spotted a group of zombies at the bottom of the sinkhole. There were 5 of them, their rotting bodies barely held together by decomposing flesh and sinew. Their eyes were milky white, devoid of any sign of humanity, and their mouths hung open, drooling blackened saliva. They hadn't seen him yet, but it was only a matter of time. Noah weighed his options. He could retreat, find another way into the city, but that would take time, and time was something he had little of. Or he could take them out quickly, quietly, and keep moving. He opted for the latter. He slid the pipe from his back, gripping it with both hands. His movements were smooth, fluid, honed by years of practice. He reached the bottom of the slope just as one of the zombies turned its head in his direction. It let out a guttural moan, and the others turned to follow its gaze. Noah moved fast. He stepped forward, swinging the pipe in a wide arc that connected with the zombie's skull. There was a sickening crunch as bone shattered, and the creature crumpled to the ground. The others lunged at him, their movements slow but relentless. He dodged the first, bringing the pipe down on its spine with enough force to sever it in half. The zombie collapsed, its arms still clawing at the ground as it tried to pull itself forward. Noah kicked it aside and turned to the next one, his expression cold and detached. The fight was over in seconds. The last zombie fell to the ground, its head caved in by a brutal swing. Noah wiped the blood from his face, breathing hard but steady. He glanced around, ensuring there were no more threats, then continued into the city. The streets were a maze of debris and destruction. Noah moved carefully, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the open areas where he could be seen. He knew better than to make noise. The zombies were drawn to sound, and a single mistake could bring a horde down on him. He followed the clues he had gathered over the years, piecing together a mental map of the city and the location of the enclave. It was said to be underground, hidden beneath one of the few buildings that remained mostly intact. But finding it would be the real challenge. The city was vast, and time was against him. Hours passed as he searched, moving from one building to the next, his frustration growing with each dead end. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ruins, and the temperature dropped. The moans of the undead grew louder, more frequent, as the darkness stirred them from their daytime lethargy. Noah was about to give up and find a place to hunker down for the night when he spotted something out of place. A building, larger than the others, with its entrance partially concealed by rubble. It was an old hospital, the kind that had been abandoned long before the outbreak. But there were signs of recent activity, a trail of footprints leading inside, and a faint light flickering in one of the upper windows. Noah approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. He stepped through the broken doorway, his eyes scanning the interior. The air was stale, filled with the scent of mold and decay. The lobby was empty, but the signs were there. Someone had been here recently. He could feel it. He moved deeper into the building, his footsteps silent on the cracked tiles. The light he had seen from outside was coming from a hallway to his left. He followed it, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors that had been forced open. At the end was a staircase leading down into the darkness. Noah hesitated for a moment, then started down the stairs. The light grew brighter as he descended, the air growing colder. He reached the bottom and found himself in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with doors, each one leading to a different room. At the far end, a single door stood ajar, the source of the light. He approached it cautiously, his hand on the handle of his revolver. He pushed the door open with his foot, revealing a large open room filled with equipment and monitors. And in the center of it all stood a man, tall and thin, with wild white hair, and a lab coat that had seen better days. Dr. Adrian Kane. Noah had found him. 2. Chapter 2. Noah stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on the man in the center of the room. Dr. Adrian Kane looked up from the array of monitors, his gaze sharp and assessing. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. Kane's face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his eyes were a piercing blue that seemed to see right through Noah. "You found me," Kane said, his voice as brittle as the air in the room. He turned away from the monitors, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I've been looking for you," Noah replied, his tone even. He didn't move from the doorway, his body tense, ready to react if Kane made a wrong move. Kane smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Everyone's looking for me, but few make it this far." He gestured to the room around him. "Welcome to my sanctuary." Noah's eyes flicked over the equipment in the room, computers, lab instruments, and vials filled with strange liquids. There was a sterile quality to the place, a stark contrast to the decay outside. "Sanctuary. Looks more like a tomb." Kane chuckled, the sound dry and hollow. "Perhaps it is, but it's mine. And it's the only place left where real work can be done." Noah took a step inside, his gaze never leaving Kane. "I've heard you're working on a cure. That true?" Kane's expression shifted, a flicker of something darker passing over his features. "A cure, yes. But not in the way you're thinking. Enlighten me." Kane moved to a nearby table, picking up a vial filled with a bright green liquid. He held it up, examining the contents with a distant gaze. "The plague that turned the world into a nightmare is complex, more so than anyone ever imagined. But I've cracked it. I've found a way to reverse the process, to bring the infected back." Noah's eyes narrowed. "Then why isn't the world crawling with the cured?" Kane's hand tightened around the vial. "Because it's not that simple. The cure, if you can call it that, requires something rare. Something nearly impossible to obtain." "And what's that?" Kane turned to face Noah, his expression hardening. "The blood of the immune." Noah felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. "Immune?" "Yes," Kane said, his voice growing more intense. "There are a few people out there, rare as diamonds, who are immune to the plague. Their blood holds the key to reversing the infection. But finding them, well, that's the challenge, isn't it?" Noah's mind raced. He had encountered rumors of people who had never turned, despite being bitten or exposed. But they were just that, rumors. And in a world as broken as this, rumors were as good as myths. "How many immune have you found?" Noah asked, his voice steady. Kane's lips thinned. "Not enough. I've had samples, some taken willingly, others not. But it's never enough. The process requires a significant amount, and most of the immune I've found didn't survive long enough to be of use." "Because you bled them dry." Noah's voice carried a hard edge. Kane didn't flinch. They knew the risks. They were given a choice: help save the world or die like the rest. Most chose to help, even if it meant their lives. Noah felt a surge of anger, but he kept it in check. "And what about those who didn't choose?" Kane's gaze darkened. "This is bigger than any one person. Sacrifices have to be made for the greater good." Noah clenched his fists. "And who made you the one to decide that?" Kane stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "I'm the only one left who can. The rest of the world is gone, buried under the weight of its own failures. I'm the only one trying to fix it." Noah stared at Kane, seeing the conviction in his eyes, the unyielding belief that what he was doing was right. It was a dangerous belief, one that had justified countless atrocities throughout history. "What happens if you get enough?" Noah asked, his voice low. "What happens if you can make the cure?" Kane's expression shifted, a twisted smile curling his lips. "Then we rebuild. We take what's left of humanity, and we start over. But this time, we do it right. No more weakness, no more chaos. Just order, controlled by those who understand what's at stake." Noah felt the weight of Kane's words, the chilling certainty behind them. This wasn't about saving humanity, it was about controlling it, bending it to the will of one man. A man who had lost sight of what it meant to be human. "Why tell me all this?" Noah asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "Because you're not just another survivor," Kane said, his gaze piercing. "You're a biologist, a man of science. You understand what's at stake. And you've come this far, you're not here by accident." Noah's heart pounded in his chest. Kane was right, he wasn't here by accident. He had spent years searching for answers, for a way to stop the plague. But the more Kane spoke, the more Noah realized that the man in front of him wasn't the solution, he was part of the problem. "I'm offering you a choice, Noah," Kane said, his voice softening. "Join me. Help me perfect the cure. Together, we can rebuild the world into something better, something stronger." Noah stared at Kane, his mind racing. The offer was tempting, too tempting. But deep down, he knew what he was really being asked to do. He would become like Kane, a man who had traded his humanity for a twisted sense of purpose. "And if I say no?" Noah asked, his voice quiet. Kane's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Then you're just another obstacle. And obstacles, they get removed." Noah felt the tension in the air, the threat hanging between them like a knife. He had come too far, seen too much to back down now. Kane was dangerous, more dangerous than any zombie outside, because he was willing to sacrifice everything in the name of his twisted vision. "I'll think about it," Noah said, his voice steady. "But I need to see more. I need to understand exactly what you're asking." Kane's expression softened slightly, though the hardness in his eyes remained. "Take your time. But don't take too long. The world outside isn't going to wait for you." Noah nodded, backing toward the door. "I'll be back." As he stepped out of the room, he felt Kane's eyes on him, cold and unblinking. He knew he had just walked into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Kane wasn't just a scientist, he was a madman, convinced that his vision was the only path forward. 3. Chapter 3. Noah didn't look back as he left the room, his boots echoing against the cold, hard floor of the underground corridor. The light from Kane's lab faded as he walked, replaced by the dim glow of the emergency lights that barely illuminated the path ahead. The air grew colder, heavier with the scent of dust and decay. The corridors twisted and turned like a maze, leading deeper into the heart of the old hospital. He moved with purpose, his mind racing. Cain was dangerous, more dangerous than any of the undead roaming the wasteland above. The man had a vision, one that would twist whatever was left of humanity into something monstrous. Noah had seen it before, in the eyes of leaders who had lost their way, blinded by their own delusions. But Cain wasn't just another madman. He was a genius, a man who had cracked the code behind the plague that had destroyed the world. If anyone could create a cure, it was him. But at what cost? Noah had seen enough death, enough suffering, to know that some things weren't worth saving. He needed time to think, to plan his next move. And for that, he needed to get out of the underground labyrinth Cain had built around himself. The corridors all looked the same, each one lined with identical doors that led to who knew where. Noah had no map, no sense of where he was going, but he followed his instincts. He had been in enough tight spots to know that getting out was the first priority. Then he could figure out what to do next. He took a left at the next intersection, the passageway narrowing as he moved forward. The walls felt closer here, the ceiling lower and the air thicker. His hand brushed the revolver at his side, a small comfort in a place like this. He hadn't needed it in Cain's lab, but he knew better than to think that meant he was safe. A sound stopped him in his tracks. A faint rustling, like something moving in the darkness ahead. Noah froze, his senses on high alert. He listened, straining to pick up any detail. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then he heard it, a low guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. He moved forward, slower now, each step deliberate. The corridor opened up into a larger space, the ceiling rising above him. He couldn't see much in the dim light, but he could feel the presence of something else in the room with him. The growling grew louder, more distinct, and then he saw it, two glowing eyes reflecting the dim light low to the ground. Noah didn't hesitate. He drew his revolver in one smooth motion, his body tense. The creature was on him in a flash, lunging from the shadows with terrifying speed. It was a dog, no a wolf or what had once been a wolf. Its fur was matted, its flesh hanging in ragged strips, and its eyes burned with a sick, unnatural light. The wolf crashed into him, its weight driving him back. He caught himself before he hit the ground, shoving the beast away with his free hand. It snapped at him, jaws clamping down just inches from his arm. Noah brought the revolver up, firing a single shot into the wolf's skull. The sound echoed through the corridor like a thunderclap, and the wolf went limp, crumpling to the ground. Noah stepped back, breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected to find anything living down here, but then again, this wasn't exactly the world he remembered. He glanced around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The room was some kind of storage area, filled with old equipment and debris. The wolf had been guarding it, or perhaps just lurking, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble into its lair. Noah holstered his revolver and moved toward the opposite end of the room. There had to be a way out, a way back to the surface. He pushed open a door and found himself in another corridor, this one slightly wider than the last. It sloped upward, a good sign. He followed it, his pace quickening. The corridor twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the bowels of the hospital. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, but Noah kept moving. He had to get out, had to clear his head before Cain's words could take root. The corridor opened up into a stairwell, the stairs winding upward into the darkness above. Noah started up, his boots clanging against the metal steps. The sound echoed through the empty space, reminding him just how alone he was down here. He reached the top of the stairs and found himself in another corridor, this one lined with doors marked with faded signs. Pediatrics, one read. ICU, said another. He was back in the hospital proper, closer to the surface, but still far from safety. Noah pushed open one of the doors, stepping into a room that had once been an office. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a desk sat in the center, overturned. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond. He could see the city, or what was left of it, bathed in the sickly glow of the moon. The streets were empty, but he knew the undead were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for any sign of life. He needed to think. Cain's offer was still fresh in his mind, the man's words echoing in his head. Join him, help him perfect the cure, and rebuild the world. It was tempting, so damn tempting, but Noah knew better. Cain wasn't offering salvation, he was offering domination, a twisted vision of the future that had no place for anyone who didn't fit his mold. Noah had seen enough of men like Cain. They thought they were the saviors, the ones who could rebuild the world in their image. But in the end, they were just as destructive as the plague that had torn the world apart. And if Noah had learned anything in his years on the road, it was that the world didn't need more saviors. It needed survivors, people who could adapt, who could rebuild without losing their humanity. But Noah was no idealist. He knew the stakes. The plague had decimated the human race, turned the world into a nightmare. If there was a chance, a real chance to end it, could he afford to walk away? He turned from the window, his mind racing. He needed more information, needed to understand exactly what Cain was planning. He couldn't make a decision based on what he had seen so far. If he was going to stop Cain, or even consider joining him, he needed to know everything. Noah moved back to the door, stepping out into the corridor. He needed to find Cain's records, his research, anything that would give him a clearer picture of what the man was really up to. The hospital was massive, but Noah had a good sense of direction, and he figured the labs would be somewhere close to where he had found Cain. He retraced his steps, moving through the darkened corridors, his mind focused. The hospital was silent, the only sound the soft rustle of his clothes as he moved. He passed room after room, each one a reminder of what the world had lost. The dead had taken everything, and now Cain was offering a twisted version of salvation. Noah found another set of stairs, this one leading down to the lower levels. He took them two at a time, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to move fast, before Cain realized he was snooping around. The man was dangerous, unpredictable, and Noah didn't want to give him any reason to suspect that he was anything other than a potential ally. The stairs led to a long, narrow corridor, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Noah moved down it, his footsteps silent, his eyes scanning the doors on either side. Most of them were locked, but one, near the end of the hall, was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a lab, similar to the one he had found Cain in, but smaller, more contained. Shelves lined the walls, filled with vials and equipment, and a computer sat on a desk in the corner, its screen casting a pale blue light across the room. Noah moved to the desk, his fingers brushing over the keyboard. The computer was locked, but he had expected that. He scanned the room, his eyes settling on a filing cabinet tucked in the corner. He moved to it, pulling open the drawers one by one. Inside were files, hundreds of them, each one marked with a patient number and a date. Noah pulled out a few, flipping through the pages. They were records, detailed accounts of Cain's experiments, his search for a cure. But what caught Noah's attention were the notes scrawled in the margins, references to immune subjects, to failed trials, to the bodies that had piled up in the pursuit of Cain's vision. Noah's gut tightened as he read. Cain had been experimenting on the immune, draining them dry in his quest for a cure. The man was a monster, willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to achieve his goals. Noah shoved the files back into the drawer, slamming it shut. He had seen enough. Cain wasn't the answer, he was the problem. The man had to be stopped before he could unleash whatever twisted version of salvation he had in mind. But Noah knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, needed to find others who understood the stakes, who could stand against Cain and his vision. Noah moved back to the door, his mind made up. He was going to stop Cain, no matter what it took. The world had suffered enough under the weight of one man's ambition. It didn't need another dictator, another madman who thought he knew better than everyone else. He stepped out into the corridor, the plan forming in his mind. He'd find others, survivors, immune, anyone who had a reason to stand against Cain. Together, they could dismantle this operation, destroy the research, and make sure that whatever dark future Cain envisioned never came to pass. Noah retraced his steps, moving quickly through the labyrinth of corridors and stairwells. The hospital was a maze, but he had a sense of where he was going now, a purpose that drove him forward. The walls closed in around him, the air growing colder and more oppressive with every step, but he didn't slow down. He reached the upper levels again, the hospital taking on a more familiar shape as he got closer to the surface. The signs on the walls pointed to the exit, and Noah followed them, the thought of fresh air and open space pushing him onward. But as he neared the main entrance, he heard voices, low, murmured tones coming from around the corner. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. There were at least 2 of them, and they were getting closer. Noah took a breath, steeling himself. He didn't have time for a confrontation, but he couldn't risk being seen either. He needed to slip past them, get outside, and disappear into the night before anyone realized what he was up to. He waited, muscles tensed as the voices grew louder. Then, just as the footsteps were about to round the corner, he moved, darting into a side room and closing the door behind him as quietly as possible. He held his breath, listening as the voices passed by, oblivious to his presence. Once they were gone, he slipped back out into the hallway, moving quickly now. The exit was just ahead, and he could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering in through the broken glass doors. He pushed through them, stepping out into the cool night air. Noah breathed in deeply, the fresh air filling his lungs. He was outside, but he knew he wasn't safe yet. Cain's people would be looking for him soon enough, and he needed to put as much distance between himself and the hospital as possible. He scanned the area, eyes adjusting to the darkness. The city loomed around him, a shadowy labyrinth of crumbling buildings and deserted streets. Somewhere out there were the undead, but they were the least of his worries now. Noah set off at a brisk pace, moving through the shadows. The city was eerily silent, the only sound the soft crunch of his boots on the pavement. He kept to the side streets, avoiding the main roads where he might be spotted. As he walked, his mind raced. He needed to find allies, people who would believe him, who would help him take down Cain. But that wasn't going to be easy. Trust was a rare commodity in this world, and even rarer when it came to matters of life and death. But Noah had something Cain didn't. He had the truth. And he was willing to use it, to expose Cain's plans and turn his own people against him if necessary. The man was playing a dangerous game, and Noah intended to beat him at it. He reached the edge of the city, the ruins giving way to open fields and forests. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, but Noah kept moving, his path lit by the faintest of starlight. He knew where he was headed, the small outpost he had passed on his way to the hospital, where a group of survivors had set up camp. They weren't immune, but they were fighters, people who had survived this long by being smart and ruthless when they needed to be. Noah knew they wouldn't trust him easily. He was an outsider, a stranger with a story that sounded too good to be true. But he had the evidence, the files he had taken from the lab, and he was willing to share them if it meant bringing Cain down. As he walked, the forest closing in around him, Noah felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The decision was made, the path clear. He was going to stop Cain, and he was going to do it by any means necessary. The night stretched on, the hours slipping away as Noah made his way through the wilderness. The forest was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional distant cry of a bird. The air was cool, the ground soft underfoot, but Noah didn't stop. He kept moving, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. Eventually the trees thinned, and Noah saw the faint glow of firelight ahead. The outpost. He approached cautiously, his steps silent on the forest floor. The camp was small, just a handful of makeshift tents clustered around a central fire. But there were people here, survivors who had managed to hold on in a world gone mad. Noah stepped into the light, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I need to talk to your leader," he said, his voice steady. "It's about Cain." The men around the fire looked up, their expressions hard and suspicious. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward. "What do you know about Cain?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Enough to know he's planning something dangerous," Noah replied. And enough to know that if we don't stop him, it's going to get a lot worse. The man studied Noah for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. Then he nodded, a brief curt gesture. "Come with me," he said. "We'll see if your story checks out." Noah followed the man into the camp, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the first step, the first move in a game that could decide the fate of what was left of humanity. He was in it now, and there was no turning back. 4. Chapter 4. Noah sat in the center of the makeshift tent, the flickering light of a single lantern casting shadows across the canvas walls. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and fear. He felt the eyes of the others on him, hard, suspicious gazes, sizing him up, weighing his words against the instinct that had kept them alive this long. The leader, the tall man with the scar, leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the table between them. His name was Sawyer, and Noah could see the hardness in his eyes, the wariness that came from years of fighting for every breath. This was a man who didn't trust easily, but Noah needed him to believe. "Start talking," Sawyer said, his voice low and gravelly. "You said you had information about Cain. Let's hear it." Noah leaned forward, his voice steady. "Cain's been experimenting on the immune," he began. "He's using them to perfect his version of the cure. But it's not just about curing the plague. He wants to control it." Sawyer's eyes narrowed. "Control it how?" "By creating a new strain, one that he can weaponize," Noah explained. "The cure he's developing isn't just a vaccine. It's a tool to manipulate the virus, to make it do what he wants. If he succeeds, he'll have the power to control who lives and who dies." The tent went silent, the weight of Noah's words hanging in the air. The other men exchanged glances, the tension palpable. Sawyer didn't move, didn't blink, his gaze fixed on Noah as if trying to see through him, to find any hint of a lie. "And you know this how?" Sawyer finally asked. "I saw his lab," Noah replied. "Saw the notes, the experiments. Cain is brilliant, no doubt about that. But he's also insane. He thinks he's saving the world, but all he's doing is twisting it into something even worse." Sawyer continued to stare at him, the silence stretching out. Noah didn't flinch, didn't look away. He had no intention of backing down now. Finally, Sawyer leaned back again, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let's say I believe you," he said slowly. "What's your plan? You think a handful of us are going to take on Cain and whatever army he's got down there?" "We don't need an army," Noah said. "We need to get inside, destroy his research, and take him out. Without the research, he's got nothing. No way to create the new strain, no way to control the plague." "And how do you propose we do that?" Sawyer asked, his tone skeptical. "Through the sewers," Noah replied. "I found a map of the old city infrastructure. There's a network of tunnels that run right under the hospital. We can use them to get in undetected, bypass most of his security." Sawyer studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the other men in the tent. They were all watching, waiting for his decision. Finally, Sawyer nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "All right," he said. "But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. No heroics, no bullshit. We go in, we get it done, and we get out." Noah nodded. "Agreed. I'm not looking to be a hero, just to stop Cain." Sawyer pushed back his chair and stood, signaling the end of the discussion. "Get some rest," he said. "We move at first light." Noah rose to his feet, feeling the eyes of the others on him as he made his way out of the tent. He stepped into the cool night air, breathing deeply. The camp was quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The men were settling down for the night, their movements slow and deliberate, like soldiers preparing for battle. Noah found a spot on the edge of the camp, away from the others, and sat down on the ground, his back against a tree. He had made his pitch, and now it was up to them to decide if they would follow him into the lion's den. He knew the risks, knew that most of them probably wouldn't make it out alive. But it was a risk they had to take. Cain couldn't be allowed to succeed. He closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind, but sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts kept drifting back to the hospital, to Kane's cold, calculating eyes, the way the man had spoken about his work, as if he were talking about a mathematical equation, not human lives. Noah knew he had to be ready for anything. Kane would have traps, security measures, and God knew what else waiting for them. The man was a genius, and he wouldn't go down easily. But Noah had faced impossible odds before. He had survived the plague, had fought his way through countless horrors to get this far. He wasn't about to back down now. The hours passed slowly, the sky gradually lightening as dawn approached. Noah remained where he was, eyes closed, listening to the sounds of the camp as the others stirred, preparing for what was to come. He could hear the clatter of weapons being checked, the low murmur of voices as plans were discussed, the occasional cough or curse as someone fought back their nerves. Finally, Sawyer appeared in front of him, his expression unreadable. "It's time," he said simply. Noah nodded and stood, stretching his stiff muscles. He followed Sawyer back to the center of the camp, where the others were gathered. They were a motley group, scarred, weathered, hardened by years of survival in a world gone mad. But there was something else in their eyes now, something Noah hadn't seen before. Determination. Sawyer looked at each of them in turn, his gaze hard. "You all know what's at stake," he said. "We go in, we do our job, and we get out. No one plays the hero. We stick together, and we watch each other's backs." "Understood." There were murmurs of agreement, nods all around. Noah saw the resolve in their faces, the acceptance of what they were about to do. They were ready. Sawyer turned to Noah. "Lead the way." Noah nodded and set off, the group falling into step behind him. He led them out of the camp, through the woods, and back toward the city. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The city loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. They reached the edge of the sewers just as the sun began to rise. The entrance was hidden, covered by a heavy metal grate that had rusted over the years. Noah knelt down, prying it open with a crowbar, the metal creaking in protest. One by one, they climbed down into the darkness, the foul smell of the sewers assaulting their senses. The tunnel was narrow, the walls slick with moisture, but Noah moved forward without hesitation, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The sewers were a labyrinth, but Noah had studied the map, memorized the turns, the dead ends, the routes that would lead them directly under the hospital. They moved in silence, the only sound the splash of their boots in the shallow water. Noah could feel the tension building, the anticipation of what was to come. They were getting closer, and he knew that once they reached the hospital, there would be no turning back. Kane would be waiting for them, and there would be no room for mistakes. Finally, they reached the point where the tunnel branched off into a series of smaller pipes, leading directly under the hospital. Noah signaled for the group to stop, turning to face them. "This is it," he said quietly. "We go up, take out any guards, and destroy the lab. Stick to the plan, and we'll make it out of here." Sawyer nodded, his expression grim. "Let's move." Noah led the way, climbing up the ladder to the access hatch that would bring them into the hospital's basement. He pushed it open, peering into the darkened room above. It was empty. He climbed out, the others following close behind. The basement was cold, the air stale. Noah could feel the weight of the building pressing down on them, the sense of being deep in enemy territory. They moved quickly, silently through the basement, following the path that would take them to Kane's lab. The tension was palpable, each step bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a guard, a tall, burly man with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He froze, eyes widening in shock as he saw the group of intruders. Noah didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's rifle and yanking it away before he could react. He delivered a swift punch to the guard's throat, dropping him to the ground in a choking heap. Sawyer and the others moved in, securing the area, but there was no time to waste. Noah motioned for them to keep moving, the urgency in his gut growing stronger. Kane would know they were here soon enough, if he didn't already. They reached the door to the lab, and Noah pressed his ear against it, listening. He could hear faint voices on the other side, the low hum of equipment. Kane was in there, along with whoever else was working for him. Noah glanced at Sawyer, who gave a nod of approval. Noah took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to come. He reached for the door, his hand gripping the cold metal handle. Noah felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was it. No turning back. He pushed the door open, slow and steady, stepping into the dimly lit lab with Sawyer and the others close behind. The room was a maze of equipment, computers humming softly, vials of chemicals lining the shelves, and a series of glass containers filled with what looked like human organs suspended in fluid. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, a sharp contrast to the decay outside. And in the center of it all stood Kane. He was taller than Noah had expected, a wiry frame wrapped in a pristine white lab coat. His eyes, cold, calculating, met Noah's as the door swung fully open. For a moment neither of them moved, the room suspended in a tense silence. Kane didn't flinch, didn't show a hint of surprise. Instead, a thin smile curled on his lips, as if he'd been expecting Noah all along. "I wondered when you'd show up, Mr. Black," he said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant. Noah kept his hand steady, his gaze locked on Kane. "It's over, Kane. We're shutting this down." Kane's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you can just walk in here and stop progress? You're more naive than I thought." Sawyer stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Kane's chest. "We're not here to debate, Doc. Step away from the equipment." Kane raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to Sawyer and the others. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The cure is within our grasp, true salvation, not just for the immune, but for everyone." Noah shook his head. "This isn't about saving people. It's about control. You're not curing the plague, you're weaponizing it." Kane chuckled, a low, sinister sound. "And what's wrong with a little control, Noah? The world is chaos. Someone has to restore order." "No," Noah said, his voice hard. "Someone has to destroy it before you can use it to play God." Kane's eyes narrowed, the smile fading from his lips. "You're making a mistake, Noah. Without my work, humanity is doomed. You know that." Noah didn't waver. "I'd rather take my chances." Kane's hand moved subtly, fingers reaching for a switch on the nearby console. But Sawyer was faster. He fired a warning shot, the bullet grazing the edge of the console, causing sparks to fly. Kane froze, his eyes flashing with anger. "Don't," Sawyer growled. "You'll only die faster." For the first time, Kane's composure slipped, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Noah seized the moment, stepping closer, his voice low and determined. "It's over, Kane. Give it up." Kane's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. He was cornered. The madness in his eyes deepened, his calm facade cracking. "You're fools," he hissed. "You think you're stopping something terrible, but you're condemning the world to an even greater hell." "Maybe," Noah said, "but at least it won't be your hell." Kane's expression twisted into a snarl, and in one swift motion he lunged for the console. But Sawyer was ready. He fired again, this time aiming true. The bullet hit Kane in the chest, dropping him to the ground with a choked gasp. The room went silent, the tension dissipating like a punctured balloon. Kane lay still, his lab coat stained with blood, eyes wide open in shock. Noah stared down at the body, a mix of relief and weariness washing over him. It was done. Kane's reign of terror, his twisted vision of the future, had come to an end. But the lab was still active, still humming with the remnants of Kane's work. Noah turned to the others, determination hardening his resolve. "We need to destroy everything," he said. "Every file, every sample. Burn it all." Sawyer nodded, already moving to plant explosives around the room. The others followed suit, setting charges on the computers, the storage units, anything that could hold the secrets of Kane's research. Noah moved to the central console, the one Kane had been so desperate to reach. The screen still glowed with data, lines of code, complex algorithms, the twisted blueprint of Kane's cure. He took a deep breath and began the deletion process, watching as the files were wiped away, one by one. The room was a flurry of activity, the men working quickly, efficiently. Noah felt a strange sense of finality as he moved through the lab, destroying the last remnants of Kane's legacy. This wasn't just about stopping one man. It was about erasing the possibility of anyone else picking up where Kane had left off. As the final charge was set, Sawyer gave the signal to retreat. They moved quickly, exiting the lab and making their way back through the basement, the sewers, the path they had carved into the heart of the hospital. The tension was still there, but now it was mixed with anticipation, the knowledge that they were about to bring down the very walls that had housed so much darkness. They reached the surface, the morning light bright and sharp against their eyes. Sawyer pulled out the detonator, his thumb hovering over the button. He glanced at Noah, a silent question in his gaze. Noah nodded. "Do it." Sawyer pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the hospital, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. The building imploded, collapsing in on itself as fire and smoke billowed into the sky. The lab, the research, the twisted vision of Kane, gone in an instant. Noah watched as the dust settled, the remains of the hospital smoldering in the morning light. It was over. Truly over. Sawyer walked over, his expression grim but satisfied. "It's done," he said. "No one's going to be finding anything useful in there." Noah nodded, exhaustion seeping into his bones. But there was also a sense of relief, a weight lifted off his shoulders. They had done what they came to do. Kane's plans had been stopped. But as he looked out over the ruins, Noah knew their work wasn't finished. The world was still broken, still crawling with the undead, and the survivors were still fighting for every breath. Noah turned to the others, his resolve hardening. "We keep moving," he said. "There's more out there. More people like Kane. We take them down one by one, until there's no one left who thinks they can control this." Sawyer nodded, and the others followed suit, their determination mirroring Noah's. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Noah took a final look at the ruins of the hospital, then turned and started walking. The others fell in behind him, their steps heavy but purposeful. They walked into the rising sun, leaving the past behind, moving forward into whatever the future held. 5. More end-of-the-world action adventure. How far would you go to keep your kids safe? When an unexpected apocalypse separates a father from his children, he leads a ragtag group of survivors on a cross-country hunt. He's going to find his kids and protect them, no matter who he has to become to do it. Fans of this series love Dad and how it's not really about zombies, in an action-packed collection that will keep you up all night swiping to find out what happens next. Click to get your copy of this complete box set that includes all 22 books in the series, and I'll send you 3 short novels for Brian, Tyler, and Miguel, set in the Battlefield Z universe. But hurry, because the 3-book bonus offer goes away in a week. Your box set includes all these: the Battlefield Z series,